Mr. Wachenheim, you are bringing a particularly impressive wealth of experience to this discussion. You were very active as a French representative to ICAO, and you have an all-encompassing view. You were the chairman of the General Conference of ICAO, I believe, in 2013. So in international terms, how do you see the current situation, and what can we expect global organizations like ICAO to do in the face of the challenge of climate change? We heard a lot yesterday from industry players about alternative fuels and other solutions. Could you give us your point of view on this? Thank you, Paul. I believe that indeed this has been a constant feature throughout our discussions over the past 2 days. The idea that aviation is an international, a global industry, and that we will not be able to move forward unless we take on board that very specific feature of aviation, which it shares, in fact, with maritime transport. So that would be my starting point. And I think very early on, the nations of the world as a whole realized how important it was to be organized on a planetary level. I won't retrace the history of ICAO. I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with it. Two things I think we need to bear in mind are, first of all, that this is an organization which brings together member states. It is not a federation of agencies, so there is no supranational power at ICAO. It brings together 193 member states as things currently stand. And these are the players who decide on the policies and on the recommendations, which are then submitted to the international community as a whole. My second point here would be that ICAO would not be able to operate if we didn't have some minimum foundation of harmonization, at least technical harmonization. It may seem self-evident, but systems have to be interoperable so that the safety of flights can be provided for. This is something which is and will continue to be essential. Now, having said that, we can look at things in two ways. I mean, what is working and what is not working? What is going well, what is not going well? Over the past 50, 75 years, ICAO has demonstrated its ability to achieve standardization of some of these technical aspects. And I think it has been able to reach the goal which it had been set. In perhaps a moment or two, I will return to some of the associated questions you could ask about the future in technical terms. But another point which we can credit ICAO for is environmental action, because many people wrongly believe that nothing has been done over the years. The fact is that ICAO started to provide for regulation in terms of environment all the way back in the 1970s, looking at noise. Noise pollution was one of the key preoccupations at the time, and the organization drafted noise standards with very strict certification criteria, which continue to pertain. We're working with the 6th generation of noise standards today, and aircraft are much less noisy in their operations than they used to be back then. And then there is another area where things have been acted upon more recently and where the issues are more complex. For one thing, ICAO has been trying to work on the technical standards that govern airplanes in a similar way to for noise, but this only came about in 2016. There are emissions standards for aircraft engines with a number of very stringent criteria, which are very thoroughly checked upon. It's not like in other areas of transports where standards might be set, but then you realize after the fact that they're not necessarily upheld. In aviation, the states have oversight powers, and ICAO in turn keeps tabs on what the states are doing and audits their action in this field. But that leaves unresolved the overall question of global greenhouse gas emissions. And we have fallen behind over time. I think we need to recognize that. Ever since the Kyoto Protocol entrusted ICAO with the charge of developing a system to supervise and monitor greenhouse gas emissions in aviation, a lot of years have gone by, and it took some time before things started to materialize. But we have seen some action over the past few years, and particularly with Corsia, which has been mentioned many times already. I think ICAO has shown here its ability to act. Now let's turn to the areas where we haven't been doing so well. Just very briefly, I think one of the areas where we're out of step with the current situation, and we saw this yesterday, is the urgent character of climate action. Valérie Masson went so far as to say that we have to act within 10 years. We can't wait for another 15 or 20 years before we start to act on this. And so the somewhat cumbersome procedures at ICAO, the way that its governance functions, could and will no doubt pose a problem in that respect. We need to tackle that part of things. Another area where I think we can do better, and we need to work on this, is when it comes to innovation. How will ICAO take on board the kinds of technical innovations which are going to be occurring and accelerating as we are hearing? There is clearly a time lag between the ability of such a massive organization with 193 states, which moves relatively slowly, and the way that standards need to be updated. Often it takes 10 years to update standards. So we need to make sure that we work with all the players from the aviation industry, and that we make sure that everyone is moving in step. Otherwise, we will see development of new technologies and fuels by other players, but nothing will be certified. So we need to make sure, in terms of initiatives, that things are done there. Perhaps some initiatives could be taken by Europe in that realm, and perhaps we can return to that.